The rain came not as a gentle spring shower, but as a furious assault, a relentless volley of water striking the windows of the Silver Spoon Diner like 1,000 tiny fists. Clara, 24 years old and feeling every minute of it, watched the streetlights of Portland, Maine, dissolve into blurry halos of gold. The nor'easter had been promising its arrival for days, and now it was delivering on that promise with a vengeance, turning the city into a churning, windswept watercolor. Most of her regulars had heeded the warnings, scurrying home hours ago to the comfort of dry socks and hot soup. Only Mr. Gable, a retired longshoreman with a face like a topographical map, remained, nursing a cup of black coffee in his usual corner booth. "You ought to pack it in, kid," he rasped, his voice a gravelly echo of the storm outside. "No one in their right mind is coming out in this." Clara managed a weary smile, wiping down the already gleaming Formica counter for what felt like the 100th time. Someone might be in their wrong mind then. "I'll stay a little longer. You never know who might need a warm place to wait out the worst of it." Her boss, a perpetually stressed man named Sal, would have chained the doors shut at the first sign of drizzle. But Sal was safe in Florida, visiting his sister, leaving Clara in charge. The diner, with its worn red vinyl and the familiar scent of coffee and frying bacon, was her sanctuary, her hiding place from a world that had chewed her up and spit her out. Staying open felt less like a duty and more like guarding a lighthouse in a storm she knew all too well. As if her words had conjured him, the bell above the door chimed a frantic, desperate tune as the door was shoved open by a brutal gust of wind and rain. An old man stumbled in, utterly drenched, his fine wool overcoat, which might have been elegant an hour ago, now a sodden, dripping weight. He was tall but stooped, with a shock of white hair plastered to his forehead and eyes that seemed lost in a fog deeper than the one shrouding the city. "Good heavens," Clara said, rushing from behind the counter. "Sir, are you all right?" The man blinked, water streaming down the weathered lines of his face. He looked around the empty diner with a bewildered air, as if he'd expected to find himself somewhere else entirely. The numbers," he mumbled, his voice thin and reedy. They don't add up." Clara gently took his arm, feeling the tremor that ran through his frail frame. "Let's get you out of those wet things. Come on, sit down." She guided him to a booth, Mr. Gable watching with silent concern. "I'll get you some coffee, hot, and some towels." She returned moments later, bundling a thick, dry dish towel around his shoulders and placing a steaming mug in front of him. His hands shook so violently that the ceramic rattled against the saucer. He stared at the coffee as if he didn't know what it was. "Where were you headed in this weather?" Clara asked gently, sliding into the booth across from him. The man's gaze remained distant. "Home," he said, then frowned. "But the ghost. The ghost is in the machine, you see. It changes the figures. It steals the soul of the place." Clara exchanged a worried glance with Mr. Gable. Dementia, perhaps, or just profound confusion from the cold. "What's your name, sir?" He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, a spark of lucidity returned to his pale blue eyes. "Arthur," he said, his voice a little stronger. "My name is Arthur." "Okay, Arthur, I'm Clara. You're safe here. We'll figure things out once you're warm." Mr. Gable drained his cup and slid a $10 bill onto his table. "I'm heading out before the roads flood completely. You got this, Clara?" "We'll be fine, Mr. Gable. You get home safe." With the old man gone, the diner fell into a quiet rhythm, punctuated only by the drumming of the rain and Arthur's occasional disjointed murmurs about unbalanced ledgers and misplaced decimals. Clara made him a grilled cheese sandwich, which he ate with a slow, mechanical precision, his eyes never quite focusing. She knew she should call the police, have them find his family. But something in his vulnerability, in the ghost of a powerful intellect she could sense behind the confusion, made her hesitate. He wasn't just a lost old man. He felt like a shipwreck, a great vessel washed ashore, and she felt an inexplicable urge to protect the wreckage. She found a wallet in his coat's inner pocket. The leather was soft and expensive, worn with age. The driver's license read Arthur Vance, with an address in Cape Elizabeth in a neighborhood of sprawling seaside estates. There were no phone numbers, only a single, crisp business card. It read simply, Vance Industries. Arthur Vance, founder. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Vance Industries was a titan, a diversified conglomerate with its gleaming headquarters dominating the Portland skyline. Arthur Vance wasn't just a lost old man. He was a legend. Or he had been. Rumors had circulated for years about his declining health and his reclusive nature since his grandson had taken over the company. The card had a single number for the main office, which would be useless at this hour. There was nothing else. No emergency contact, no family photos, just the stark, lonely card of a man who had built an empire. "Arthur," she said softly, "is there anyone I can call for you? Your family?" He looked up from his empty plate, his eyes clouded over again. "They're all gone," he whispered, "all swallowed by the numbers." Clara's heart ached for him. She made a decision. The police could wait until morning. Tonight, he was her responsibility. She made him a makeshift bed in the back office on a cot she sometimes used during double shifts, covering him with her own coat. He fell asleep almost instantly, a faint, troubled frown etched on his face. For the rest of the night, Clara sat in the main diner, watching the storm rage, the weight of the sleeping king in her back office a strange and heavy comfort. She thought about her own past, about the world of numbers and ledgers she had fled. A world where men in expensive suits moved decimal points and ruined lives without a second thought. A world that had tried to erase her. In the quiet solitude of the diner, with a Titan's forgotten founder sleeping peacefully nearby, she felt a flicker of the person she used to be, sharp, analytical, and unwilling to let a single inconsistency slide. The morning sun, when it finally broke through the bruised, retreating clouds, was pale and apologetic. The city was a mess of downed branches and flooded streets, but the storm had passed. Clara was brewing the day's first pot of coffee when the diner door opened with a force that made the bell clang like an alarm. A man stood there silhouetted against the bright, clean morning. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that seemed utterly out of place in the Silver Spoon. His face was all sharp angles and controlled impatience, his dark hair impeccably styled, his eyes the same pale blue as Arthur's, but cold and hard as glacial ice. He scanned the diner with the quick, dismissive appraisal of a man used to owning every room he entered. "I'm looking for Arthur Vance," he said. His voice was deep and resonant, a command, not a question. Clara felt her spine stiffen. She had learned to recognize this particular brand of man, armored in wealth and entitlement, viewing the world as a set of problems to be solved or obstacles to be removed. "He's here," she said calmly, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's safe." The man's shoulders relaxed by a fraction of an inch, the only sign of his relief. "Where is he?" "I'm Julian Vance, his grandson." "He's in the back, sleeping. He was exhausted and hypothermic when he came in last night." "Take me to him." Clara didn't move. "He's resting peacefully. I'd rather not wake him just yet." Julian Vance's eyes narrowed. "I didn't fly from Zurich and drive through the dregs of a nor'easter to be told I can't see my own grandfather. Now, are you going to show me where he is, or do I find him myself?" The arrogance was so familiar it made her teeth ache. She'd faced down men like him in boardrooms, men who used their power like a cudgel. She wasn't that woman anymore, but the muscle memory remained. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dropping to a low, even tone that had once made junior analysts tremble. "Your grandfather sought shelter in my establishment. I gave it to him. He is currently my guest. He is also an elderly man who has been through a significant ordeal. You will not be storming in and disturbing him. You can wait here. I will bring you a cup of coffee, and when he wakes up, I will let him know you've arrived." They stood in a silent standoff, the air crackling with tension. Julian Vance was clearly not accustomed to being denied anything. He seemed to be reassessing her, his sharp gaze taking in her worn sneakers, her faded jeans, her simple apron. The calculation in his eyes was plain. Who is this person to stand up to me? To her surprise, he gave a curt, single nod. "Fine, coffee black." He slid into the booth Arthur had occupied the night before, pulling out a sleek smartphone and immediately becoming engrossed in whatever crisis was unfolding on its screen. Clara brought him the coffee, setting it down with a steady hand. He didn't look up. She went about her morning prep. The rhythmic chop of onions and the sizzle of bacon on the griddle, a comforting counterpoint to the tense silence. An hour later, Arthur emerged from the back room, looking rested and much more composed. He saw Julian, and a genuine, radiant smile lit up his face. "Julian! My boy, what are you doing here?" Julian was on his feet instantly, his cold demeanor melting away to reveal a deep, genuine affection. "Grandfather, you had us all worried sick. You wandered off." "Did I? I had the most curious dream," Arthur said, looking around the diner. He spotted Clara behind the counter. "Ah, and this kind young lady. She gave me shelter from the storm, and a remarkable grilled cheese." Julian turned to Clara, pulling out a thick alligator skin wallet. "I appreciate your help. What do I owe you for your trouble?" He began to pull out several $100 bills. The casual transaction, the assumption that her kindness had a price tag, reignited Clara's anger. "You owe me nothing, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice sharp. "It's called human decency. It's not an item on the menu." Julian paused, the money in his hand. He looked at her, truly looked at her this time, and a flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed his face. Arthur chuckled softly. "She's got spirit, this one. I like her." He turned to Clara. "Thank you, my dear, truly. I'm afraid I caused a terrible fuss." "It was no fuss at all, Arthur," she said, her voice softening. "I'm just glad you're safe." As Julian helped his grandfather with his coat, another man entered the diner. He was older than Julian, with silvering temples and a smile that was both charming and predatory. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who belonged in rooms of power. "Julian, thank God," the man said, clapping a hand on Julian's shoulder. "When security called and said Arthur's tracking bracelet went offline, we feared the worst. I've been coordinating with the police all night." He noticed Clara and his smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And you must be the Good Samaritan, Marcus Thorne." He extended a hand. "I'm the COO of Vance Industries. We are all incredibly grateful." Clara shook his hand, a strange sense of unease prickling at her. There was something slick and polished about him, a veneer that felt too perfect. "It was my pleasure," she said simply. "We've arranged for Dr. Evans to meet us at the house," Marcus said to Julian. "We should go." As they were about to leave, Arthur stopped and turned back to Clara. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the Vance Industries business card she'd seen last night. He took her hand, his own surprisingly warm, and pressed the card into her palm. "The ghost, my dear," he whispered, his eyes suddenly sharp and lucid again. "You'll find the ghost in the machine. Follow the decimals. They always leave a trail." Then the fog descended again, and he allowed Julian and Marcus to lead him out of the diner and into a waiting black sedan. Clara was left standing in the morning sunlight, the heavy, expensive card feeling like a strange inheritance in her hand, the old man's cryptic words echoing in her ears. 2 days later, Clara was in the middle of the lunch rush when the black sedan pulled up again. This time, only Julian Vance got out. He entered the diner, the lunchtime clatter seeming to quiet for a moment as all eyes turned to the man who radiated an aura of wealth so potent it was practically a scent. He walked directly to the counter. "I need to talk to you." "I'm a little busy," Clara said, gesturing to the crowded diner. "It's important." She sighed, handing an order slip to the cook. "You have 5 minutes. Talk." "My grandfather won't stop talking about you," Julian began, his tone formal. "He insists you're the only one who understands his concerns." "His concerns about the ghost in the machine?" Julian's jaw tightened. "He's not well, miss. I'm sorry, I don't even know your name." "It's Clara Rossi." "Miss Rossi, my grandfather has early-stage vascular dementia. He has moments of clarity, but he also has delusions. He gets fixated on things. Lately, it's been numbers, old financial reports, things he thinks are wrong with the company." "And you're sure they're delusions?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Julian gave her a hard look. "Vance Industries has a team of the best accountants and auditors in the country. I assure you, our books are in order." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "He's become difficult for his nurses to handle. He trusts you. He thinks you can help him find his ghost. It's nonsense, of course, but it's the only thing that calms him down. He took a deep breath, the polished CEO facade cracking to reveal a grandson struggling with a painful reality. I have a proposition. I need a companion for him, someone to sit with him, listen to his stories, indulge his projects. The nursing agency can't find anyone he'll accept. He's asking for you. Clara stared at him, bewildered. You want to hire me to be your grandfather's companion? I'm a waitress. You're the person he trusts. I'll pay you 5 times what you make here. More. Name your price. Once again, he was trying to solve a problem with money, but this time it was different. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the love for his grandfather warring with his frustration, and she thought of Arthur's whisper, "Follow the decimals." A strange, dormant part of her, the part that lived for the thrill of the hunt through endless columns of figures, stirred to life. "It wouldn't be about the money," she said slowly. "Then what is it about?" "I'd need to see what he's working on," she said, testing the waters. "His financial reports, to indulge him, as you said." Julian hesitated, his suspicion returning. "Why would you care about old financial reports?" Clara leaned forward, her voice low. 4 years ago, I was a senior forensic accountant at Sterling Analytics in New York. I uncovered a massive fraud scheme involving a hedge fund client. I brought it to my superiors. The next day, my computer was wiped, my files were gone, and a fabricated report with my digital signature on it was discovered, implicating me in the very fraud I was trying to expose. I was fired, blacklisted. They ruined me, Mr. Vance. I came here to disappear. Your grandfather's delusions sound an awful lot like the patterns I was trained to recognize. Maybe he's not crazy. Maybe he's the only one sane enough to see what's really going on. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unbelievable. Julian stared at her, his mind clearly working to process this new information. He saw not a simple waitress, but someone with a past, someone with a very specific and dangerous skill set. "If I agree to this," he said finally, his voice cautious, "it is solely to humor my grandfather. You are not to interfere with company business. You are a companion, nothing more. Do you understand?" "I understand perfectly," Clara said, a ghost of her old confident smile touching her lips. "You want me to find a ghost you don't believe exists? Fine. When do I start?" The Vance estate in Cape Elizabeth was less a house and more a declaration of war and modesty. It was a sprawling stone and glass structure perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, the waves crashing below like a permanent, moody soundtrack. Clara felt like an imposter walking through the massive front doors, her simple canvas tote bag a stark contrast to the museum-quality art on the walls. Arthur was in his study, a magnificent room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and smelling of old paper and sea salt. He was hunched over a large table covered in stacks of financial statements, quarterly reports, and printouts. He looked up as she entered, and the same lucid, intelligent spark she'd seen in the diner returned to his eyes. "Clara, I knew you'd come," he said, his voice full of relief. "Julian said you would. He's a good boy, just blind. He can't see the trees for the forest." For the next few weeks, Clara fell into a new routine. She would spend her days with Arthur, listening to his stories of building his empire from a small machine shop into a global powerhouse. He was a brilliant man, and in his moments of clarity, he spoke with a passion and vision that was breathtaking. But then the fog would roll in, and he would retreat back to his obsession, pointing at columns of figures with a trembling finger. "There, you see," he'd insist, "the asset depreciation schedule for the logistics division. It was accelerated in 2021. No reason, no board approval, just changed, a little puff of smoke, a ghost." To honor her promise to Julian, Clara would simply nod and listen, making notes on a legal pad. But in the evenings, back in the small guest cottage they had given her, the forensic accountant in her would take over. She started with the small things Arthur pointed out: an accelerated depreciation schedule, an unusual spike in consulting fees paid to a newly formed LLC, a subsidiary in South America sold for a price that seemed suspiciously below market value. Individually, they were explainable. deniable. Little puffs of smoke, just as Arthur had said. But Clara knew how to read smoke signals. She began to connect them, drawing lines between seemingly unrelated events, creating a map of the ghost movements. Marcus Thorne was a frequent visitor to the estate, always impeccably dressed, always oozing a placid, reassuring charm. He treated Clara with a polite condescension, calling her the girl and patting her on the shoulder as if she were a favored pet. "So good of you to keep Arthur company," he said to her one afternoon, finding her in the study with the old man. "It's so important he stays calm and doesn't excite himself with these fantasies." His eyes flicked to the papers spread across the table, a glint of something cold and hard in his gaze before the charming smile returned. Clara felt a chill. Marcus was always there, steering conversations away from business, dismissing Arthur's concerns as symptoms of his illness. He was the gatekeeper, the soother, the protector, and Clara was becoming increasingly certain he was the ghost. Julian was rarely at the estate, consumed by the demands of the company. When he was there, he was torn. He saw how much happier his grandfather was with Clara around, but he remained deeply skeptical of her involvement in Arthur's work. "He seems better," he admitted to her one evening, finding her on the terrace watching the sunset. "He is better when he feels he's being heard," Clara replied. "Are you still encouraging his obsession with these numbers?" he asked, a hint of accusation in his voice. "I'm listening to him," she corrected gently. "There's a difference." She decided to take a risk. The sale of the Argentinian subsidiary, Vance Sur. The buyer was a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. The price was 30% below the lowest independent valuation. All the proceeds were then reinvested into a high-risk tech venture that went bankrupt 6 months later. The entire value of the subsidiary vanished, Julian frowned. "That deal was handled by Marcus. He assured me it was the best offer we could get in a volatile market. The tech investment was a calculated risk that didn't pay off. It happens." "It happens," Clara agreed. But the consulting firm that advised on the sale, Thorne Strategic Solutions, was incorporated by Marcus's brother-in-law 3 days before the deal was initiated. They were paid a 7-figure fee. "Does that also just happen, Mr. Vance?" Julian went very still. He stared at her, the casual confidence draining from his face, replaced by a dawning, horrified suspicion. "How do you know that?" "The ghost leaves a trail," she said softly, echoing his grandfather's words. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, his expression hardening. "It's Marcus. We have a dinner meeting tonight at Aurelia. The board is signing off on the sale of the Maritime Logistics Division." Clara's blood ran cold. The Logistics Division was Arthur's first major acquisition, the heart of the original company. "You can't let him sell it," she said, her voice urgent. "It's a sound business decision. The division is underperforming. It's underperforming because its assets have been systematically devalued for the last 3 years," Clara interrupted, her professional passion overriding her caution. "The depreciation schedules, the maintenance budget slashed, the contracts renegotiated at a loss. It's being deliberately crippled so it can be sold for pennies on the dollar." "To whom, Julian? Who is the buyer?" He looked at her, his face a mask of conflict. The man he had trusted for 15 years, his mentor, versus the waitress who had wandered into his life a few weeks ago. "I have to go," he said, turning away. "This is a board-level decision. It's already in motion." Clara watched him leave, a sense of desperate urgency gripping her. She had the map, she had the smoke signals, but she didn't have the fire. She didn't have undeniable proof. And Marcus was about to sell the heart of the company right out from under the man who built it. She looked back at the house where Arthur was likely sleeping. She couldn't let that happen. Aurelia was the kind of restaurant where the silence was more expensive than the wine. It was a temple of quiet power, all dark wood, hushed tones, and starched white linen. Clara, dressed in a simple black dress she'd bought at a thrift store, felt as conspicuous as a crow in a flock of doves. She had used her last paycheck from the diner to pay for the taxi, a desperate gamble on a half-formed plan. She had convinced Arthur's evening nurse that the old man was feeling restless and that a quiet drive might do him good. It was a lie, a betrayal of trust, but a necessary one. She had Arthur wait in the taxi while she went inside. She found the private dining room easily. Through the glass doors, she could see the entire board of Vance Industries seated around a long mahogany table. Julian was at the head, looking grim. Marcus was beside him, smoothly presenting a series of charts, his voice a confident, persuasive murmur. Documents were being passed around. Pens were being produced. Clara took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Every head in the room turned. The quiet conversation ceased. Marcus's face, when he saw her, was a brief, unguarded flash of pure fury before the charming mask snapped back into place. "Clara," Julian said, his voice tight with shock and anger. "What are you doing here? This is a private meeting." "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice remarkably steady. She walked further into the room, her gaze fixed on Marcus. "But before you sign those papers, you should know precisely who you are making a deal with." A heavy, expensive silence fell over the room. Julian's face was a mask of controlled fury, his knuckles white where he gripped the arm of his chair. "Clara, this is a private board meeting. You have 10 seconds to leave before I have you removed for trespassing." Marcus Thorne, however, saw an opportunity. He rose slowly, a picture of magnanimous condescension. His smile was a silken, venomous thing. Now, Julian, let's not be hasty. This is Miss Rossi, gentlemen, a companion we hired for Arthur. A dear girl, but prone to flights of fancy. The stress of dealing with his condition has clearly taken a toll." He turned his gaze on her, his voice dripping with faux pity. "Clara, we all appreciate your concern, but you are out of your depth. You're confused. Why don't you go home before you say something you'll truly regret?" It was a masterful stroke of psychological warfare, designed to paint her as hysterical, unstable, the little woman unraveling. She had seen this tactic before, in other boardrooms, wielded by other men in other expensive suits. The memory, sharp and bitter, did not make her flinch. It forged her spine into steel. "Am I confused, Marcus?" Her voice did not tremble. It was low, clear, and carried the cold, resonant weight of fact. It sliced through the hushed ambiance of the restaurant. "Let's talk about the buyer for the Maritime Logistics Division, Oceanic Transport Group. A fine name. It sounds established, solid, but it was incorporated 6 weeks ago in Delaware. Its sole director is a man named Charles Peltier. Does that name ring a bell? It should. He's your brother-in-law's divorce attorney." A ripple of unease went through the room. A board member shifted in his seat. Marcus's smile tightened by a barely perceptible millimeter. "Delaware is a popular state for incorporation. It's a coincidence. This is slanderous." "Is it slander?" Clara continued, taking a step closer to the table, her presence suddenly filling the room. "To point out that Oceanic Transport Group is funded by a single private equity loan? A loan that originates from a holding company in the Cayman Islands, a company whose ownership traces back, through 3 layers of meticulously constructed anonymity, to a trust established for the benefit of your 2 children?" The blood drained from Marcus's face. The charming mask was gone, replaced by the stark, reptilian fury of a predator exposed. Julian stared at him, the pieces visibly, painfully clicking into place in his mind. That's an unsubstantiated accusation," Marcus snarled, his voice losing its polished baritone. "Then let's talk about substantiated facts," Clara said, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the board members. "Ask him about the maintenance deferrals for the division's 3 largest container ships, a decision he personally authorized, which has left them non-compliant with international maritime regulations, a fact that would only be discovered by a new owner after the sale. Ask him about the revised fuel contracts he negotiated, locking the division into paying 30% above market rate for the next 5 years. He hasn't just undervalued this division, he has poisoned it from the inside. He isn't selling an underperforming asset. He's selling a Trojan horse filled with liabilities that will bankrupt the buyer. And when Oceanic Transport Group inevitably defaults on its loan, who will be there to pick up the pieces, the ships, the port leases, for pennies on the dollar? The very trust that funded the deal in the first place." She let her words hang in the dead air. It was a checkmate. She hadn't needed Arthur's dramatic entrance. The numbers, as he had whispered, had their own soul, their own voice. She had simply become their translator. Julian rose from his chair. The movement was slow, deliberate, laden with a terrible weight. He did not look at Clara. He did not look at the board. His eyes, glacial and shattered, were fixed on the man he had called his mentor. The silence stretched, thin and taut. The entire future of Vance Industries seemed to be contained in that moment, balanced on the edge of a knife. "Marcus," Julian said, his voice a raw, hollow sound, "is any of this true?" "Julian, this is absurd," Marcus blustered, trying to rally. "She's a waitress, a nobody. You can't possibly take her word over mine." It was the wrong thing to say. In that moment of panic, he had revealed his fatal flaw, a complete underestimation of the people he deemed beneath him. Julian picked up the thick sheaf of papers in front of him, the sales agreement that would have sealed the company's fate. He held it in his hands, looking down at the signature line, as if seeing it for the first time. Then, with a quiet, final gesture, he ripped it in two. The sound of tearing paper was like a gunshot in the silent room. He let the pieces fall from his fingers onto the polished mahogany. He lifted his gaze back to Marcus. The grief in his eyes had hardened into something cold and absolute. "Security will meet you at your office. You have 5 minutes to collect your personal effects. An injunction will be filed by morning, freezing your assets pending a full investigation. If you attempt to contact anyone at this company, I will consider it obstruction. Now get out of my sight." Marcus Thorne stared, his face a canvas of disbelief and incandescent rage. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the fight draining out of him as he looked at the stony faces of the board members, at the cold finality in Julian's eyes. His empire, built on whispers and shadows, had been dismantled in 5 minutes by a waitress. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, a ghost exorcised by the light. The door clicked shut. The tension in the room did not dissipate. It transformed. The board members erupted into a low cacophony of panicked whispers. Julian ignored them. He finally turned to Clara, and his expression was unreadable. He looked not at a savior, but at the embodiment of his own catastrophic failure of judgment. "Wait for me in the lobby," he commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. Then he turned his attention to the board, and the CEO returned, his tone now clipped and authoritative. "This meeting is adjourned. An emergency session will be held tomorrow at 8 a.m. I expect full cooperation from every one of you." Clara slipped out of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. The adrenaline that had sustained her began to recede, leaving behind a profound, trembling exhaustion. She had won. She had faced the beast and slain it. But as she stood alone in the opulent, empty lobby of Aurelia, she did not feel triumphant. She just felt like a ghost herself, caught between a world she had fled and one she no longer belonged to. The weeks that followed were a descent into a quiet, orderly hell. The word investigation was a sterile term for the messy, brutal process of vivisecting a company to find a cancer. Julian, moving with the grim focus of a battlefield surgeon, hired a top-tier forensic accounting firm from New York. Clara, to her profound ambivalence, was pulled into the vortex. She was given a temporary security badge and a sterile, glass-walled office at the Vance Industries headquarters. The space was an anonymous cube of gray carpet and brushed steel, a world away from the warm, coffee-scented familiarity of the silver spoon. For the first few days, she was treated with a cautious, almost fearful politeness by the staff and a thinly veiled skepticism by the team of auditors. They saw a waitress, a founder's companion, an anomaly in their world of spreadsheets and SEC filings. Julian did not install her as a leader. He simply opened the door and let her find her own place. He was a constant, brooding presence, working 70-hour weeks, his face etched with a permanent exhaustion. He spoke to her only when necessary, his tone professional and distant. The chasm of his betrayal by Marcus and by his own blindness was something he was navigating alone. Clara found her voice not in meetings, but in the data. She would spend 10 hours a day tracing the ghost path, the faint trails of corrupted data and phantom transactions Marcus had left behind. The auditors were methodical, but she was intuitive. She knew Marcus's psychology, his blend of arrogance and meticulousness. "You're looking in the wrong place," she said one evening to the lead auditor, a man named Peterson who viewed her with deep suspicion. They were trying to unravel the finances of a subsidiary in Singapore. Marcus wouldn't hide the theft in the operating expenses. Too crude. He'd disguise it as a capital investment. Look at the server farm upgrade from Q3 last year. Cross-reference the hardware serial numbers on the purchase order with the asset inventory. I bet you'll find half of them are ghosts. Peterson gave her a condescending look but ran the check to humor her. An hour later, he came to her office, his face pale. Over $3 million in hardware that was paid for was never delivered, he said, his voice hushed with dawning respect. The purchase orders were signed off by Marcus. That was the turning point. From then on, they saw her not as a waitress, but as a bloodhound. The work was consuming, dredging up memories of her old life. The thrill of the chase, the intellectual rigor, but also the sting of the betrayal that had sent her running in the first place. Some nights she would drive home to her small apartment and stare at the wall, feeling the suffocating weight of the corporate world pressing in on her, the ghost of her past life wrapping its cold fingers around her throat. She had escaped this once. What was she doing willingly walking back into the fire? One night, deep into the third week, Julian found her alone in the cavernous, silent office, a single lamp illuminating a mountain of files on her desk. He didn't say anything, just placed a cardboard container of coffee and a paper bag on the corner of her desk. He finally broke the silence that had stretched between them since that night at Aurelia. "I never thanked you." Clara didn't look up from the ledger she was studying. "You didn't have to. You tore up the contract. That was enough." "No, it wasn't," he said, his voice low and raw. He sank into the visitor's chair opposite her, looking utterly defeated. "He was my father's best friend. He taught me how to sail. He was the executor of my parents' will. He stood next to me at their funeral." He rubbed his face with his hands. "How could I have been so blind?" "You weren't blind," she said, finally looking at him. She saw not a CEO, but a man grieving a profound and complicated loss. "You were loyal. Marcus counted on that. He weaponized your best qualities against you. And my grandfather," he trailed off, his voice thick with shame. "I treated him like a problem to be managed, a legacy to be contained. I put a tracking bracelet on him, for God's sake. And all along, he was the only one who saw the truth. He was trying to tell me, and I put it down to delusions." "You did what you thought was best with the information you had," Clara said softly. "You listened when it counted." A fragile peace began to form in those late-night conversations over stale coffee and takeout containers. It wasn't a friendship, not yet, but a shared foxhole camaraderie. He began to see the woman behind the brilliant analyst, her weariness, her quiet strength, and she began to see the man behind the armor of wealth and power, his deep sense of duty, his pain, and his burgeoning, humbling respect for her. The ghost trail led them deeper and deeper into the company's history. The fraud was older, more insidious than they had imagined. It was a slow, systematic bleeding that had begun years ago. As they neared the end of their investigation, having compiled an airtight case for the federal prosecutor, Clara found the one thing she hadn't been looking for. It was a digital folder, buried deep on a server, mislabeled and forgotten. It contained records of a series of payments made 4 years prior from a Vance Industries slush fund, authorized by Marcus Thorne, to a private investigator. The target of the investigation was Sterling Analytics. The goal was to acquire compromising information on a senior analyst who was getting too close to a hedge fund client, a client that Vance Industries secretly held a major stake in. The analyst's name was Clara Rossi. She stared at the screen, the breath leaving her body in a silent rush. It hadn't been random. Her life hadn't just fallen apart. It had been dismantled. Marcus hadn't just been a generic villain in a suit. He had been her villain, the architect of her ruin, long before she ever knew his name. The ghost that haunted Arthur's ledgers was the very same one that had haunted her life for 4 years. The storm hadn't brought a random old man to her diner. It had brought the source of her pain, and with it, the chance for her own reckoning. The room tilted, the neat columns of figures blurring into an incomprehensible scrawl. She felt a wave of nausea, followed by a cold, clarifying rage. The final report was a 500-page indictment of Marcus Thorne's tenure. The case was presented to the board in the same room where Clara had first confronted them. This time, she sat at the table next to Julian, a recognized expert, her findings presented by Peterson with repeated deferential credit to her work. When it was over, Julian called her to Arthur's old office, a room he had refused to occupy until now. The afternoon sun streamed through the vast window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room felt like a sanctuary, a place of quiet, enduring integrity. "The board has approved the creation of a new division," Julian began, his tone formal. "An Office of Corporate Integrity. It will report directly to the CEO and have unprecedented authority to audit any department, review any transaction, and veto any new venture that carries unacceptable ethical risk. It needs to be led by someone unimpeachable, someone who understands that the soul of a company is just as important as its bottom line." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "They've asked me to offer you the position, Executive Vice President, Chief Integrity Officer." Clara felt the floor shift beneath her feet. The title, the authority, the sheer scale of the offer was staggering. It wasn't just a job, it was a coronation. It was the world that had cast her out, now begging her to be its gatekeeper. She thought of the diner, of the simple peace she had found there, the anonymity that had been her shield. She could go back. Sal would hire her in a heartbeat. She could have a quiet life. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because you're the only person I know who is immune to the disease," he said simply. "You've seen the worst of this world, what it does to people. You've been broken by it. And you still chose to do the right thing, not for money or for power, but simply because it was right. That makes you the most qualified person on the planet." He took a step closer. "I also know what Marcus did to you, at Sterling. I read the file." His voice was laced with a quiet fury. "This isn't just a job offer, Clara. It's restitution. It's a chance to take the very system that was used to destroy you and remake it in your image." She looked out the window at the city, at the harbor where the fishing boats bobbed on the tide. She thought of the girl who had arrived in Portland 4 years ago, a ghost of her former self, hoping only to disappear. And she thought of the woman standing here now, being offered a kingdom. The running was over. "I have conditions," she said, her voice finding its strength. A slow smile spread across Julian's face. "I would be disappointed if you didn't." 1 year later, the autumn sunlight, crisp and golden, streamed through the windows of the Seaside Care Facility. Arthur Vance sat in a comfortable armchair, a tartan blanket over his knees, looking out at the endless blue of the Atlantic. Some days he was lost in the fog, a gentle, smiling stranger. But today was a clear day. Clara sat opposite him, reading him the business section of the Wall Street Journal. Her new life was a whirlwind of meetings, contracts, and immense pressure. But she made time for these visits every week. They were her anchor, a reminder of how this impossible new chapter had begun. Julian arrived a few minutes later, shedding his CEO persona at the door and becoming simply a grandson. He kissed Arthur's forehead and took the chair beside Clara. Arthur lowered the paper and looked from Julian to Clara, his pale blue eyes startlingly lucid. "The depreciation schedules for the new fleet," he said, his voice a clear rasp. "Did you account for the change in salinity regulations? It will affect hull corrosion rates." Julian smiled. "We did, grandfather. Clara caught it. Saved us a few million in long-term maintenance." Arthur nodded, satisfied. He looked at Clara, a deep, knowing fondness in his eyes. "You're good for him. You're good for the company." He reached out a frail, trembling hand and placed it over hers. "The ghost is gone. The machine has its soul back." He then turned his attention back to the ocean, his mind drifting away on the tide. The moment of clarity passed. Julian reached across, his hand covering both of theirs. A comfortable silence settled over the three of them, a quiet testament to the storm they had weathered together. Later that evening, Clara stood in her office, Arthur's old office. It was her office now. She had kept his books, his maritime maps, his faint scent of paper and sea salt. It was a space that felt both like a legacy and a promise. She looked out at the lights of Portland twinkling to life, the city that had been her refuge, now the seat of her new empire. The silver spoon was still down there, a tiny beacon of warmth, serving coffee to other lost souls. It had been her sanctuary, her hiding place, but she didn't need to hide anymore. The journey had been violent and strange. It had torn her apart and forged her into someone new, someone stronger. She was not just the waitress. She was not just the analyst. She was both and more. A storm had tried to break her, but instead, it had washed her clean. The ledger was balanced, and for the first time in a very long time, Clara Rossi felt whole.